Hello again. So let's start by developing our motivation to think about how we are determined or we're interested in developing ourselves to work towards benefiting all beings, and that we may use these moments, these precious moments we have towards that, our goal. And then and particularly with this talk or how we listen, how I talk, for me, to consider how best to adopt, to consider, um, to accept or to reject, to learn from and to use in our lives what's going to be discussed. So this is not just me talking randomly, but something like maybe an opportunity for us to change. This is not me. It's not, I mean, I'm doing my best not to sort of tell you my views. This is mainly the views of our tradition of of Buddhism, as taught to me by my teachers. And I'm just trying to do my best to share. So it's not, um, so I might easily make a mistake. Mistakes I make are not necessarily the mistakes of my teachers, but I believe there's something here for us that is really beneficial. Okay, so last week we covered, or last session, I should say, we covered uh, the aspects of the perfection of giving. So where at the moment and now what we're going to be talking this week is about the perfection of ethical discipline. So the second of the six perfections of a bodhisattva. So just in terms of the fact this is quite a short chapter, it might be a good idea to review something about what it is we're doing and put it into its place. So uh, people who call ourselves Buddhists believe that we are all slightly or very asleep and not really able to understand precisely what's happening around us, and we act accordingly. So the way in which we act in the world is based on a sort of sleepy response to the world, and we make mistakes, and those mistakes cause us grief and cause us harm, and that's what we're wanting to work on, is to prevent us from this turmoil, um, internal and external turmoil that causes us a lot of grief and unhappiness. Um, So a part of that is the idea of recognizing that it's possible for us to wake up, and waking up is being awake is a good translation of the word Buddha or Bodhi. So to be awake is to be free from this sleepiness or this sort of drowsy confusion that we're in. So within that awakening, we can see that as we begin to learn what the awakened people have told us, we begin to see clearly more and more. And as we see clearly, we begin to recognize that we're not alone in this, that actually this is a global problem, a universal problem. And as we are also able to begin to recognize the underlying conditions for that sleepiness, we develop an awareness of how it is able to free us from our suffering, from this turmoil. So, having been able to do that, we develop a sense of compassion towards all beings who have the same conditions that we have. We recognize that it's available to be avoided, and from that sense of the availability of a path that's able to be trodden by all beings, then there's a sense of wanting to benefit, but we're not able to benefit while we are stuck ourselves. And so, therefore, in order to be able to really benefit, substantially benefit beings, we have to awaken ourselves first. So that mind of working towards um, of working towards awakening ourselves or becoming a Buddha, in order to benefit all beings is known as bodhicitta, the mind of awakening or the mind of enlightenment. And so within that, we are saying to ourselves, we're making a commitment. This is the path we want to do. And as Buddha expresses, and this is a Mahayana path, as Buddha expresses in terms of that journey, the journey that he himself took, which is recognized by all traditions of Buddhism, there are a series of developmental practices that one has as one's view is refined and as one's compassion and loving kindness is refined. So as this becomes more and more strong, some things become much easier for us to do. And as they become easier for us to do, we begin to carve away at the turmoil that we're creating within ourselves, but also the turmoil that we would be generating out into the world. So the first part of this, as we've covered, was really when we've begun to develop a strong awareness of our bodhicitta, and also a part of our insight into the nature of reality or emptiness or the Four Noble Truths. Then, as our insight becomes more clear, we lose any sense of strong clinging and grasping at ourselves and those things we own. And we also begin to feel more and more generous and loving and cherishing towards all beings. And because of this, there's a tendency for our generosity to increase. So we're working on our generosity, and as we work on our generosity, we're able to reinforce and recognize those areas where we would otherwise struggle. So again, in light of that, the generosity, which is sort of this expression of love cherishing, we also begin to move on to recognizing that we don't wish to cause harm, and we don't want to have harm for ourselves or for others, and that leads us really into and quite naturally into the perfection of ethical discipline. Within Buddhist structure, harm and harmfulness is the basis of wrongdoing. So what we're looking at here is removing that harm based on the cherishing mind of a bodhisattva, a being who is walking, has chosen to, is committed to becoming awake for the benefit of all beings. So that's where we are now. So Je Rinpoche says to us, we need to consider what ethical discipline is, how to develop it, how to begin to develop it, and looking at the various aspects of it, and how to practice it. And then he's going to offer a short summary, and we should be able to cover all of that today. So Je Rinpoche says, first of all, that what we're looking at is this idea of an abstention or a turning away from harming. So we're looking away at primarily giving is more about seeing what we can give, and is turning towards giving or to benefiting. So it's a loving, and turning away from harming is based in compassion. So these two are very strongly related. And what we're wanting to do is to recognize that this behavior, this particular behavior or that particular behavior, has a consequence of harm. So again, one of the aspects of giving is we need to be aware of the consequences of what happens, and ethical discipline helps us to recognize and to develop a sense of the consequences of our actions, and provides us with the opportunity to begin to develop more insight into karmic action. So it says the perfection of this turning away from causing harm is done through continually habituating ourselves with turning away and from making harm, and being aware and sustaining our vigilance and our mindfulness to the point where we are able to more subtly reduce the harm that we're causing both to ourselves and to others. And he says, just to be clear, because there is often talk in the text of sort of the infinite, the infinite nature or the the perfection of ethical discipline. But he says it's not as if, in order for us to perfect it, we have to ensure that there is all beings, all harm is removed from all beings, because that is actually the overarching large task. We are able to work on our perfection of ethical discipline without having to do that in the bigger picture. And he says, essentially, whether all living beings in the universe are freed or not freed from harm makes no difference in this particular context. What we're working on is on our mind, on our mind stream, the attitude, the continual attitude of abstention from causing harm to all beings. So it's more to do, like we said before, with the nature of great compassion, great love, and based on impartiality, that we do not that whatever circumstances arise, however the circumstances arise, we sustain the ability to turn away from causing harm, even the slightest harm. So he cites Shantideva, who says that it's from the Bodhisattva deeds. It said that by attaining the attitude of abstention, we perfect ethical discipline. So this is where we're wanting to avoid doing something, whereas with giving we're very much doing something. And these two aspects again work together and also work with each other. So I think really as one becomes more experienced with giving, one becomes more wise to giving and more aware of some of the ways in which giving can backfire, if you like, or go wrong. And so as we become more aware of the needs and meeting the needs of others, we become more skillful at it. And that skillfulness itself is a natural arising of ethical discipline. So it's not as if we have to work all the time on this, but it's also not as if we can just let it naturally evolve, because what we want to do, just like I said before with giving, is by restraining and sustaining an attitude of restraining from making mistakes, we're able to see where our view or our compassion, our loving kindness is wanting, it has blocks. So that gives us a good insight into, okay, well, I need to work on that. So then Je Rinpoche goes and he says to us, primarily there are sort of three divisions classically to ethical, to the meaning of ethical discipline. And this would be the restraint that we've talked about so far, but also of gathering virtue, of developing benefits, and then also acting for the welfare of all beings, so continually working on the welfare of all beings. But he says, within this particular context, in terms of the way in which we want to focus on ethical discipline within the six perfections, it's primarily concerned with the action of abstention. The other two are obviously present and very, very relevant to the Bodhisattva path. Of course, we're developing a huge amount of merit through, for instance, generosity, and likewise, we are continually doing our best to work towards the benefit of all sentient beings. So those two sort of are covered by our actions throughout all six perfections. And in that sense, Je Rinpoche is saying, yeah, we need to think about it in terms of this perfection. We're talking primarily about restraint. And then he says, in terms of if we want to include our motivational aspect, which is very relevant, then it's not just our what we say and what we do; it's how we think in terms of our motivations. Then he says there's 10. If we put the motivations to one side, then it's 7. And he says, so therefore, in terms of what it really is, it's our activities that go out, but in order to do that, we need to think about the paths of those activities, which includes our motivations. So, if we have a mind of malice, that is likely, whether we're aware of it or not, it's going to arise in malicious activity. And so, what we want to do is to cut both the malice and also any activity that would arise from it. And these 10 that he's talking about are the same 10 virtuous and non-virtuous actions that we were talking about in the low scope. They're not separate in any way whatsoever. So in brief, the 3 sorts of minds are wrong view, attachment, and malice. And then the 4 speech are lying and slander or aggressive words or causing aggression, and sort of just idle rubbish. And then in terms of physical action, it's sexual misconduct, stealing and killing. So those sorts of things really are definitely coarse, and but they're a very, very important place for us to start. And I think why I say that's coarse is because as we develop, as we grow in our practice, the subtlety of these things become more and more apparent to us. And even a very subtle sort of affliction, such as a subtle malice or subtle attention, can lead to a dramatically a more dangerous effect. So if we think about it in terms of if somebody who's spiritually advanced, if they say something or they do something, whereas other people would be like, okay, yeah, well, you're silly or whatever. But somebody who is a leader or a religious leader who has a lot of people who listen to them, then if they say the same thing or do the same thing, it has a much, much more dramatic effect. So what we see is, as we are developing ourselves, there is more and more attention or more and more power to what it is that we do. And in those cases, we have to be more and more and more vigilant. So it doesn't really matter if we're famous or not famous. This is a part of our path that, in fact, it starts off reasonably in terms of, this is Geshe used to say, it starts off like a broad road. We're talking about discipline, self-discipline, ethical discipline. But as we develop along that road, it becomes narrower and narrower and narrower until it's more like a tightrope. Now, some of this is because if our mind's not correct, or if our mind deviates slightly from the path, then the opportunities for us to commit a mistake are far, far more available to us because of the power that's arisen from our practice. On the other hand, also, we're in a position where not only is it easy for us to deviate, but we're aware of, on the other side, completely on the other side, the potential consequences of what might seem to be a very subtle action. And when we're not aware of it, that subtle action or subtle thought can lead to very, very dramatic consequences. So just because we're developing ourselves, we become more and more able to cause more harm from more small things. But meantime, of course, we're also able to do vast amounts of more benefit. So we have to become more and more vigilant in this sense. So this Je Rinpoche says, Chandrakirti talks about ethical discipline as being some of the advantages is that it prevents wrongdoing from arising, and it's cool. It's like a cool sort of a cooling and refreshing benefit, because it removes any sort of fire of regret or remorse. So when we make a mistake, one of the aspects of making a mistake and is this sort of turmoil that happens afterwards, immediately this mental turmoil of either remorse or regret or a sense of disappointment in ourselves. And it's very easy for us to start to sort of punish ourselves too much. And this itself is a problem too, because harm isn't a great cure of harm. But what we do need to do is to recognize that the regret, the remorse is valid, and for us to be determined not to repeat it. So this is really much, much more important than beating ourselves up, is to say, okay, I've got to learn from this. This is an opportunity to learn from this. So one of the aspects of this is not to be wasteful of a wrongdoing, but to use it as much as one can to be very, very more aware of what not to do in the future. It doesn't mean that we should go on committing wrongdoing. This would be a complete mistake. I mean, we're working on actually removing it completely, right? So it's like saying, oh yeah, Ben says it's okay. I'm not saying that. I'm saying we've got to be aware of the benefits of not doing this. And in generally, when we recognize that wrongdoing, both in terms of the inner responses, the inner consequences of this sort of turmoil, and this turmoil is not always regret or remorse. We might feel justified in it, but we can see that we're struggling with it because it takes over a lot of our mind. So when we're justifying it, and it's like we're thinking about it a lot, it can burn us out quite a lot. Then this would be wrongdoing because it's causing suffering, right? So those aspects are, even if we're like just trying to justify ourselves or we're feeling that it's right, in the end, there's some sort of discord taking place. And this would be, maybe it was actually a deliberate wrongdoing, maybe it was not a deliberate wrongdoing, but the consequences there are turmoil. And normally, why we're feeling this sort of self-justification is because we feel that they didn't really understand the situation. They've taken it out of context, and therefore, they're the ones who's got to deal with it. It's like, yeah, well, okay, but if that's always the case, if that's what's really going on, then why is it concerning us so much? Right? So in these situations, we have to be a bit more aware of saying, what can I really do to prevent turmoil in others as well as myself? Of course, we're not always in control of the feelings and thoughts of others, and some people may easily want to make accusations or jump to conclusions which are mistaken. But at the same time, we want to be in a position where we can avoid that happening in the first place. So if we are able to avoid that in the first place, then that prevents that sort of turmoil happening. We don't want them to suffer, both in terms of actually having directly caused suffering or in terms of them feeling suffering. So in that sense, it's like we find rules and stuff in the Vinaya about how we should be available for others to see that accusations made against us are not valid, right? So these sorts of things are especially when we're in private space, then this can be much more complex for us to be able to stand straight. So when we're working on this, we've sort of, hopefully we've recognized the importance of self-discipline in terms of developing concentration, right? Concentration rests on a calm mind and a mind not in turmoil, not disturbed, an undisturbed mind. And therefore, an undisturbed mind is generated from strong self-discipline, from a very, very clear, strong, stable self-discipline, not wasting our time, doing things that are useful, making sure that what we're doing is valid, making sure that what we're doing is beneficial and helpful, right? So when we do this, when we work well, when we use our day, when we fill our moments with benefit, this very, very strong calm arises, and there's a sense of having done things properly, I guess, would be the best way. So when we see it, when we begin to recognize that sort of mind, then it helps for us to diminish our lack of self-discipline. We begin to see the benefit of it. But we can still easily be overrun by emotions. We can still be easily overrun by our wrong view, or our ignorance, or our unwillingness to accept the benefit there, which is sort of not at all unusual. So this is something we do need to work on. And Je Rinpoche says that how we begin to cultivate this is to recognize that self-discipline is a part of the path. It's part of the path to awakening. And therefore, for us to be able to teach it, we've got to live it. So he says, when we recognize that we've made a choice to benefit all beings, and we want, we're encouraging all beings to walk the path to Buddhahood, to this awakening, then we ourselves must understand the trials and burdens of ethical discipline. And not only that, we need to be able to be awakened ourselves in order to be able to establish that in others. So he says, this is from Asanga's Compendium of Perfections, he says, if you cannot achieve your own welfare with faulty ethical discipline, where on earth will you get the strength for the benefit of others? Therefore, those who strive for the benefit of others do not relax in terms of their vigilance or their devotion to their own self-discipline. So this is where we're moving on into a bit, he says, primarily when we're developing pure discipline, primarily what we're doing is based on, as is said, on what to do and what not to do. So what we want to do and what we do not want to do. We want to avoid that which causes suffering. We want to do that which causes joy. Now, joy that we're talking about here isn't temporary. It's lasting joy, one that actually is going to lead to awakening, lead to Buddhahood. So within that, then, that obviously requires an understanding of, an empathy with beings, where they are in the path, and how best to benefit them in terms of their understanding. And that level of insight, again, is letting go of our own convictions, our own views on things, and sort of saying, okay, in order to be able to benefit, I need to understand the views of others around me, and work with those views too. So Je Rinpoche sort of says that we've got to really be careful with ourselves and precious about sustaining our self-discipline and not allowing ourselves to slip, even when we are very tired or excited by something, or just lapsed into a stupor. Then these sorts of things become very dangerous for us, and we've got to do our best to maintain this safeguarding of our self-discipline. The benefit of safeguarding is not just for ourselves, it's for everybody who we come into touch with. And he says, one of the good ways of dealing with this is, in terms of safeguarding, is to think about, to really consider and spend time considering what the benefits of safeguarding are, and what the drawbacks of not safeguarding are, and how it can just lead to our entire practice being destroyed, and all the benefit that we were trying to bring to the world, how easily it is to be destroyed. So for me personally, I sort of find this is very relevant because Geshe-la, my teacher, has said again and again to me, that this is my weakness, that self-discipline is my weakness, and I'm sure he's not wrong. So in many ways, this sort of really is the idea of saying, okay, well, understanding that maintaining this ethical life is very, very important, and it is especially challenging for us when we live in in the world, especially a world where there isn't much sangha available, not many fellow practitioners available for us to sustain an awareness of doing the right thing and not doing the wrong thing. So he says when we become more aware of the terrible consequences that can happen, this happens to everybody. I mean, this is not at all unusual. But he says when it happens, if we're able to see the consequences of these downfalls, uh, and and um, and indeed, one can look in the news and recent and old news of religious leaders or practitioners who failed, or regardless of whichever tradition we're looking at, you can see the huge consequences that these events have happened in terms of attitudes towards those spiritual practices. So these sorts of things are absolutely massive, and we've got to be aware of, saying all the time, well, that's not what I'm here for. That's not what I'm about. This is not a part of what I want to do. So I need to sustain the safeguarding. And he says, in terms of benefits, if we think about the benefits in terms of being strong, being able to sustain our being able to sustain our safeguard our ethical discipline, then the benefits are so strong. Not only do they lead to joy in our lives, they lead to stable meditation, they lead to enlightenment, they lead to all sorts of benefits. So in this sense, he says, who's he citing? I think he's citing Arisura, Compendium of Perfections, where he says, does anything more marvelous come from ethical discipline? He said, even the Buddhas and the teaching they give arise from ethical discipline. So Je Rinpoche is making the point here also, remember, that karma and right view or understanding of emptiness are totally linked to each other. As we understand dependent arising, our view of emptiness and our view of karma becomes more and more clear. And therefore, when we develop this ethical discipline, which is all about thinking about karma and its consequences, actions and consequences, what to do, what not to do, how to benefit, right? This isn't a passive thing. This is an active, aware mind, aware of the consequences of every single minute action that we make. Then this leads to and helps to develop this compassionate nature of the bodhisattvas that we're working on, helps to eliminate obstacles to our compassion, and also provides us with this sort of peace, fulfillment. And he says there's one of the things is sort of like if you think about jewelry or makeup and perfume, these sorts of things, these ornaments is the word used in the Tibetan text. So if you put them on a child, if you put sort of lipstick and sort of big necklaces and crowns and ornaments onto a small child, then it sort of looks really silly. And and then if you put it onto somebody who's very old, then also it looks a bit silly, right? So he says these sorts of ornaments they don't really work on the very young, or they don't really work on the very old. But the ornaments, he says, of ethical discipline, it doesn't matter how old you are at all. When you see a self-disciplined child who's filled with kindness, generosity, free of judgment, but able to sustain an understanding of suffering or the cause of suffering, then everybody is like, wow, amazing. The same with somebody who's old. When we see this quality of self-discipline, everybody admires them. And he says again, for instance, there are, you know, things like potions or what's it called, deodorants. Yeah. So when you're in the hot weather, then it covers the smell of your body and so on. And monks and nuns are prohibited from using these sorts of things. So he says, although this sort of these lotions and things help you know, that although they're removed from the availability for those who are on the monastic path, it is actually far more sublime and gives far more rest and far less smell, if you like, if they're able to sustain that ethical discipline. So the idea is to say that we have a tendency to look on the outer material, but in fact it's the inner material, it's the inner actions, the inner life that in fact we often see, and which generates the greatest effect. So we have this sort of thing where he's saying, you know, we don't need to worry about deodorant if we're able to sustain our self-discipline. I don't think he suggests that if we're not able to sustain our self-discipline, we should then use deodorant. I think that would be a mistake. But yeah, I think it's, yeah, saying that like that. Instead, we need to work on our discipline. He says again also, one doesn't need to be, one doesn't need to use flattering words, one doesn't need to do marketing, one doesn't need to sell, one doesn't need to dress up or adorn to mislead, to sort of, yeah, one doesn't need to dress up if our self-discipline is strong, right? In fact, in the end, it's this inequality that people are going to be most comfortable with and most worried about when it's not present. So in terms of our ability as a practitioner or as a teacher or anything in terms of our spiritual path, we don't need to dress in exotic clothes. What we need to do is to sustain and retain our discipline. And he says, for instance, people who are, he says that people will recognize it. I mean, there's this idea primarily that we can recognize, not necessarily consciously, but at an unconscious level, we recognize people who are able to sustain this sort of generous, compassionate mind, also that is marked by the ability for us to control ourselves, right? So if we're able to control ourselves, we're able to be aware of the needs of saying the right thing to the right person, then there's a very strong sense of trustworthiness in this. Yeah. So with that, then primarily what we're looking to do is this generates a sort of a natural kindness or an immediate response of comfort or trust. And he says, you know, we don't even need to say anything. We don't need to undertake hardship, but we find necessities and service arises naturally. And people are less likely to talk about us in a sort of casual or a dismissive sort of way. I mean, I think with it says the casual, this is from Compendium of Perfections by Asanga, and I think what he's really sort of saying is, like, you know, people might tell, sort of stand-up comedians might tell jokes about lots of different people, but they tend not to tell jokes about the Dalai Lama too much, because it's sort of like, you know, he's doing his best. He's doing his best as a person. So in this way, they're like, okay, it's not really a subject of improper talk in that sense, right? So he says, therefore, if we're able to sustain our ethical discipline, then and once we own it, once we're able to do it, then we enter into a new category of living, a completely different category of living, um, where we are no longer under the control of our emotions, or our sort of or wrong views, and this primarily is where we have really demonstrated through our self-discipline the strength and the validity of our bodhicitta, the mind of awakening, and also our insight, such that we're no longer tempted by things that lead towards rotten consequences or confusion. So in a sense, there's this thing which I've heard like His Holiness talking about, saying in a sense this is because we want to be happy. So there's an understanding of almost of a selfishness of saying, well, I don't want to suffer the consequences of these actions, so therefore I won't make them. Right? It's not like, so once our view's correct, and we see, oh no, this just goes nowhere. This is just a mess. This is just going to cause pain and trouble, right? So in that sense, it's like when we see clearly and we're able to sustain that insight, then it's like, I don't want to go into that mess. I don't want to eat that poison. So why would I, right? So this way is saying that we learn to we begin to start thinking very carefully about that safeguarding of sustaining that safeguarding, sort of like this vigilance, this mindfulness. So it says, we're not really necessarily concerned about uh, uh, it's not so much about our suffering in really as our bodhicitta improves. It's not so much about our own suffering, worried about our suffering, um, because what we're seeing is that we need to sustain this mind of enlightenment, right? Of our goal of achieving enlightenment, and in order to do that, um, we don't want to engage in anything that causes suffering, but also we need to have this very powerful mind. So developing that powerful mind rests on that discipline, and therefore for us to make these mistakes is basically giving up on um, it's sort of a sense removing our commitment to all beings. We've said, okay, I'm going to work towards all to benefit all beings, and then if I'm not doing that, then I'm sort of letting them all down. Yeah. So there's like, that's not great. It's worse than that. It's sort of like, this is just not doing what I said I would do. So then, having mentioned briefly the three divisions of ethical discipline, Jerem Shea wants to sort of look into them a little bit more detail. So we start off with the restraint one, which is what we've been talking about. And he says that one of the aspects of restraint primarily is actually looking at the vows that we already have taken. So this might be as a monk or a nun, it might be as well as the bodhisattva vows, but it might be also the vows we've taken as a layperson. And this is our starting point. So we've got to be consistent. Not only are we going to be setting ourselves up against these vows, we're also setting ourselves up against the laws of the land. We're also setting ourselves up against ensuring, and more importantly, ensuring that what we do in the moment is not going to be a cause of harm. But our starting point is going to be the vows, the vows that we have taken. And he says, there are plenty of us who have taken the bodhisattva vows, not really suitable for taking any of the monastic or similar vows. And for those, then anything that is wrong by nature, so anything wrong in this sense means causes harm. Yeah, and we'll be going back to that later on. And he says, in terms of gathering virtue, this is exactly the virtues of the six perfections that we're engaging in as a bodhisattva. And also to work on it, making sure that we develop those that we haven't yet developed, and that we don't spoil those that we have developed, and increase all of these continually. So to make sure that I continue to become, to develop, but also prevent from being spoiled. So there's two aspects of gathering virtue. So in terms of acting for the welfare of living beings, again, he says, one way of doing this is talk about sort of the 11 types of living beings, which again is used as a part of this meditation process where we're thinking about it within, those who are poor, those who are not poor, those who are hungry, those who are not hungry. So these sort of ideas is trying to work on using these meditation approaches where we look at sort of dividing up the world in one way or another into different categories, and then addressing the particular needs and the particular welfares that they require. But in the end, everybody is covered, or everybody. There's nobody left out, and it's just a way of thinking about how we need to deal with people in given situations, helping us to consider how we would want to behave given those opportunities. So then there's quite a lot that Je Rinpoche says about how the Vinaya, the vows of individual liberation, the vows of a monk or a nun, are generally done within the idea of leaving samsara for oneself. And he says, but here we're not talking about that. I'm not saying to you that therefore this is somehow because the monastic vows are for your own liberation, that therefore we can put them to one side when acting as a bodhisattva. Quite the opposite. What he's saying is, when we are engaged as a bodhisattva and we're thinking about all beings, then if we've taken these vows, those vows are absolutely relevant to us in terms of legitimizing both that path, but also our path as a bodhisattva. So we are under scrutiny as practitioners, especially as members of the Sangha, or those of us who've taken vows. We are continually being scrutinized. Anybody who's doing even a small amount of teaching, like myself, we're under more scrutiny than if we're just a normal person wandering the street. So we have to be more and more aware, and it's easy to make downfalls. And I think one of the aspects of this is to recognize, okay, well, that's something I'll never do again. But the point about it is to say, ideally, we don't have to do that. We don't make those mistakes. Yeah. So I think one of the Rinpoches said, when we break or we make a mistake, it's like we're breaking a bone. The bone will heal over time, but it'll never be as strong or as able as it used to be unbroken. So likewise, we've got to think very, very carefully about trying to reinforce and sustain our vigilance moment to moment, and especially to recognize for us the triggers where our self-discipline is more likely to fail. What sort of circumstances we're at greater risk at, and to prevent those circumstances from arising. So we might be particularly vulnerable in certain situations, and in terms of our discipline. And in those situations, these are things we would be wanting to work to avoid. In the end, other people might want to help us with this, but in the end, it's going to be us ourselves who have to make that decision. So when we're aware of this thing, become more aware of it, then we need to think, okay, actually, this isn't appropriate, this isn't suitable, whatever. Determined to not do it, finish it like that. So he says, don't think, if you think, oh, these vows the monastic vows aren't that important, even though I'm a monk or a nun, then that's just a complete mistake. It's mistaking the whole purpose of what we're doing, which is to be able to demonstrate, regardless of where we are, what we're doing, the ability to sustain ethical discipline. Not only that, those vows of a monk or a nun are there in place for us to be able to develop a very, very powerful, calm, gentle mind in order to become liberated. This is not distinguished from the calm. This calmness of mind is not distinguished by your motivation for being a bodhisattva or not being a bodhisattva. So it's not as if we can say that, yes, although the lineage of these vows may come from Sravaka or from a personal liberation lineage, the way in which we treat them is completely different. As Mahayanas, as those who are practicing for the benefit of all, that doesn't mean that they're becoming illegitimate. So this is what Je Rinpoche is saying here. And then going back to what I said earlier on, I've noticed I have this tendency to sort of to jump to the sort of the consequence right at the beginning, but I mean the conclusions right at the beginning. But Je Rinpoche says to us, the principal aspect, the foundation aspect of ethical discipline of restraint is abstaining from deeds which are wrong by nature. Wrong by nature means causes harm. Yeah, it causes harm to ourselves, causes harm to our others, causes distress, causes turmoil, causes physical pain, causes a lack of, causes disempowerment. Yeah. So something that disempowers or that is causing trouble or turmoil or is causing anxiety or is causing fear or is causing physical or emotional pain is a problem. It's wrong. And he says in general, when we want to look at that again, that the way in which this is initially determined, or the way in which this is determined at first, is through thinking about the 10 non-virtuous actions, which was what I was saying at the beginning. So they are the major faults of the deeds that are wrong by nature. He says major, not just all. So this is where we start with. And then from this, we can begin to work on and develop and understand how best to cease doing wrong. And he says he quotes from the Compendium of Perfections. He says, "Don't let these paths of action degenerate. They are the paths to the joy of high status or even enlightenment. If we're able to maintain these, we reach our goals." So we need to continually contemplate how we wish to help and benefit beings, how our love and our cherishing mind goes to all sentient beings, all beings, and therefore for us to blame them or to criticize them or to feel or to wish to punish them or to cause or to be coarsely attached to them or to disempower them, none of this is correct. So he says, again, for Compendium of Perfection, I think I slightly went over the quote there. Compendium of Perfection says, we correctly restrain our body, speech, and mind, and this, in brief, is ethical discipline. So he says, this is what we need to do, this restraint. So again, restraint is one of these things where there's often, in the modern world, a confusion or conflation between restraint and repression. And what we're saying is not repress. Repress is sort of like keep pushed under. What we're saying is to stop it, to restrain from it, is to prevent it from taking place at all. So that doesn't mean that if we're angry and we think, and then I think, okay, well, I'm not going to do anything about it, but I let that anger boil inside. There's no good for us, because that anger is still motivating our actions. It just becomes unconscious, or we become less aware of it. In a sense, we begin to hide our actions from our emotions, and this is a mistake. It's a flaw. So in order for us to be able to actually restrain from them, we need to we need to cut through that anger or that malice or that gross attachment. And we do this by using meditation. So different types of meditation, but one of the more often used initially when we begin to work on this is to recognize that if I feel um, loving kindness towards and a wish for happiness and a wish for peace towards somebody, it's very hard for me to sustain a wish for harm towards that same person. So it's like saying, if I change my point of view and see how I wish peace on them, then this helps to diminish or to cut through this harmfulness that I'm feeling. Likewise, if I have a core sense of desire or attraction or attachment towards somebody, if I'm able to then perceive something about them which I find repugnant, then that attraction diminishes. It doesn't mean that we're saying that repugnant, or we have to sort of go around that. It's just helping us work on diminishing those things which would otherwise go out of hand. Likewise, jealousy or envy, and we see somebody who is like, how comes they get that and I don't get that? Then it's far better for us to work on rejoicing, saying how amazing it is what they've managed to do. That it's astounding that they've managed to get this sort of stuff, and feel great. Feel a sense of joy in their achievement, rather than sort of, why not me? So these sorts of things is trying to find a way of being more flexible with our minds, trying to get away from these compulsive behaviors which can otherwise dominate us. Yeah, So not repression, not sort of pushing it under, not denying it, recognizing it and dealing with it. Okay, just because we recognize this emotion within it doesn't make it ours, right? These emotions arise in not everybody, and they're not ours. They're not ours. Say, oh, this is legitimate because it's my feeling, right? We're not even working on that level. The idea that this is my feeling is a mistake. It's just as easily replaced with another feeling, yeah, which is just as much ours. So this idea that somehow something that arises spontaneously is valid is a complete mistake for us. We've got to recognize that, yeah, we're untrained. We're untrained. We have untrained minds. They go all over the place. So we're saying, okay, well, look, just because this feeling arises doesn't make it valid. I've got to say, well, how valid is it? So given a particular context, let's say I feel it's valid for me to say, I've I'm working to devote my lives to the benefit of all beings, then how is this valid? How is it valid within that context? Right? So it's like, I really want to have that ice cream. I know it's not going to be any good for me. Oh, well, I'll go for it anyway. And it's like, well, how is that valid just because I want it anyway? Yeah. So these sorts of ideas, primarily, we need to think a bit more carefully about the validity of buying into the idea just because this thought's arisen in me that somehow I need to own it. I need to take ownership of it, right? So, and again, with that sort of thought is then, recognizing within context how it doesn't even fit within who I believe myself to be, or who I want to be, uh, or what I'm trying to represent, or where I'm trying to go. So this restraint that is being mentioned in terms of ethical discipline is being aware of safeguarding ourselves from the mistakes we'll otherwise naturally make, and also to be able to say, look, I don't need to take ownership of this stuff. I don't feel, I can't even associate with it. So in that sense, like saying, yes, I need to recognize this has arisen from my mind. If I don't do that, I'm going to be in denial, and it will just come up again and again and again in different ways, and I'll be plagued by it. So I have to be clear about saying, you know, I've got to to dissolve it, or to flip it, or to recognize it as not being as powerful over me as I might imagine it to be, that it's only really in the end something which is transient and whatever. So when we're working on our mind this way, then needless to say that what we say and what we do changes accordingly. When we see something coming out of our mind that affects our body or our speech, and we may, because it happens spontaneously and uncontrolled, and then later on we think, why on earth did I do that? Then it's like saying, okay, well, somewhere there was a wrong view, or there was a mistaken view, or there was a belligerence and malice, or there was attachment, right? So it's like saying, okay, and that led to this, and this needs to be worked on. So anyway, I think that's so. Then Je Rinpoche says, okay, so how do we practice it? We practice it in association with our existing practice, in association with our development of the six perfections. We certainly don't let it ignore it. We need to allow our lives to be governed by self-discipline, by the with ethical controls, ethical discipline, not just sustaining our practice, but actually being aware ethically, bringing to life our generosity by thinking about consequences, right? Bringing to life our awareness of consequence, karma, right? The actions and consequences, the bringing this to life, being aware of this, making sure that what we do doesn't cause immediate harm to anybody, making sure that it doesn't cause to lasting harm to anybody. And lasting harm primarily is to say a disaffection with doing the right thing, becoming a better person, becoming a Buddha, being able to achieve spiritually. We don't want other people, like out of jealousy or whatever. We don't want to have that mind where we're trying to diminish other people's progress in the path. Quite the opposite. We want to work and trying to assist and help and benefit everybody in their spiritual path. Yeah, we want to benefit them any way we can. So that love that we're feeling, that great sense of love, impartial love, and towards all beings, is like we're always trying to see a way of being able to offer an opportunity, and we'll get it wrong sometimes. But when we do, what we need to do is to allow ourselves to see, to accept it, see how to deal with it, prevent it from happening again in the future. So we're using these things as they arise to help to benefit ourselves and benefit all beings, right? So then ideally what we're trying to do is to make sure that they never happen, that none of this happens. But when they do, then we need to be able to deal with it. And ideally, and the way in which we deal with it is being able to reinforce and develop our vigilance, our self-discipline, our ability, our safeguarding for ourselves, safeguarding for all sentient beings. Okay, so I think in brief, we're sort of covered covered the chapter on ethical discipline, and then what we'll be moving on to is the practice of patience next week, right? So patience and tolerance. So let's, for this session, let's think about delegating any merit. So again, this is about ensuring that any benefits has come from this, that we put it into action, we make a difference, and we're going to use this any insights that we may have gained either in light of or in spite of ban, to consider to make it a part of our lives, to actually live it, and for the purpose of doing what we can to become better people, but also to awaken ourselves and to be able to be in a position to awaken and free all beings from the suffering that they currently experience. Okay, so let's now just sit for a minute or two and to contemplate how we can change our lives.